Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a la sexta sesión del Seminario de Contradiluvio. El tema de hoy es el mundo de las finanzas y la economía y su relación con el cambio climático. Y primero quería como un poco introducir, ¿no?, la razón por la que hemos decidido hacer una sesión sobre este tema. Yo creo que en nuestros entornos, en nuestras organizaciones, es muy común decir que la culpa del cambio climático la tiene el capitalismo, y creo que como aproximación como de primer orden es algo que es absolutamente cierto. Lo que pasa es que las aproximaciones de primer orden muchas veces son, ¿no?, ciertas pero poco útiles, en el sentido de que no te dicen demasiado sobre qué hacer, o, ¿no?, de qué forma intervenir o qué soluciones buscar. Entonces, por eso hemos invitado ya a James a hablar de este tema. Nuestra idea un poco es que él profundice un poco más, ¿no?, en las dinámicas económicas que hay en el mundo de la economía, de las finanzas. Él va a hacer una introducción un poco general sobre cómo se está adaptando la economía y las finanzas al cambio climático, ¿no?, cómo está afectando eso a su funcionamiento, a sus dogmas, ¿no?, a sus mecanismos e instituciones. Luego espero que en las preguntas podamos, ¿no?, como un poco aterrizarlo, profundizar, preguntar cosas más, ¿no?, específicas, concretas, que nos interesen y que pensamos que son importantes. Un momento. Y bueno, para introducirle a él, digamos, ¿no?, James Meadway, para los que no lo conozcáis, es el director de un think tank en Londres que se llama Progressive Economic Forum, que tiene como objetivo, ¿no?, pensar una nueva macroeconomía, una nueva marco macroeconómico para el Reino Unido. También fue asistente de John McDonnell entre los años 2015 y 2018. John McDonnell era el Shadow Chancellor del Reino Unido. Es una cosa que pierde mucho, ¿no?, en la traducción, pero es algo así como el equivalente al ministro de Economía del Reino Unido para la oposición, ¿no?, del gobierno. Y creo que poco más. Pues muchas gracias a todos por venir otra vez. Muchas gracias a James por venir y le doy paso a la charla.
Okay. All right, thank you. It's that strange business is being amplified more than I expected, but thank you for the invite to come and speak in this lecture series. You've had a couple of, I noticed, very good previous people appearing here. Richard Seymour a couple of weeks ago, I see. And I wanted to try and sort of pitch my remarks at fairly kind of broad level. It's quite a big sort of thematic thing, and I'm very happy to get into some of the specifics in the Q&A as mentioned. But I wanted to start with an illustration of some of the relationships between finance and the climate, this was doing the rounds on Twitter or Facebook or one of these terrible places as a kind of way of mocking anybody, and it's a bit cruel really, because the people who are losing out with Bitcoin are the kind of people who really believed in it. Like the absolute cynics out there have made a great deal of money, but the people who really bought into it are the ones now losing a lot of money. And what this chart shows you is the price of Bitcoin in white, in US dollars, basically since the start of the pandemic, since January 2020, on the left-hand side, and then the price of avocados in green, appropriately, on the left-hand side, Bitcoin on the right-hand side. And what you see is a couple of things. First of all, you can see that big surge at the end of 2020 when everyone got very excited and bought Bitcoin. It was going to change the world, and then it didn't. And then there was another big surge at the end of last year when everybody got very excited and Bitcoin was going to change the world, and it didn't. This is around the time that it was being advertised on in between breaks and the Super Bowl, with Matt Damon, I think, doing the talk about why everyone should buy Bitcoin. If you bought $1,000 of Bitcoin then, you'd now have about $400 left. So that's, you know, to give an indication of decline. On the other hand, if you'd managed to buy avocados, or at least avocado futures, at almost exactly the same time, you'd be doing really exceptionally better. So if you want a guide to the future, and I'm quite serious about this, if you want a guide to the future, what happens to avocados is probably more important than what happens to Bitcoin. The reason I say this is a couple of things, because you have to try and sort of get into why it is that Bitcoin's falling in price now, and why it is that this isn't going to transform how capitalism works. in quite the way it's sold. I mean, it's meant to be this great liberatory device. In fact, it isn't. And one of the things it gets sold as is related to that blue line that you can see there, which is, in this case, it's US inflation and the price index, again, since the start of the pandemic all the way through to now. And like much of the developed world, certainly in Britain, where inflation has been somewhat ahead of the rest of Europe, for reasons basically relating to Brexit. I mean, this has added 1 or 2% onto everything. But pretty much everywhere has seen this big increase in inflation. And the big claim by the enthusiasts of cryptocurrency was that this would act as a hedge against inflation. In other words, although the price of everything measured in our boring old fiat currencies, in other words, the currencies that you or I would normally use, whether it's the euro or the dollar or the pound, the sort of thing that you have a central bank, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, whatever, is overseeing this fiat currency system. That if we'd gone out and bought these, gone out and relied on these boring old fiat currencies, we'd now be losing money because everything's going up in price in fiat currencies. I get paid in pounds and things in pounds are costing more and more. That means I'm getting paid less and less. Same goes if you're getting paid in euros, not quite as bad. Same goes if you're getting paid in dollars. Again, it's not quite as bad as in Britain, but it's still, you're losing money. And the theory was, if you buy cryptocurrency, it's like buying this wild new form of gold or something that just won't lose value, and it'll be your hedge against inflation. And what's actually happened is the value of cryptocurrency has fallen as the value of fiat currencies has also fallen, as the value of assets in those fiat currencies has fallen alongside them. So it's not a hedge, it's not a protection against what happens in capitalism. And the reason it's not a protection against what happens in capitalism is pretty simple, is that as cryptocurrencies led by Bitcoin have got bigger and bigger, have become more and more involved with the financial system. In other words, that you have extremely large, very powerful financial institutions. You know, far from this being some upstart thing that you do if you're, I mean, frankly, I get a bit fed up with Elon Musk presented as an upstart figure. The guy's like the richest person on the planet right now. This means he is not like fundamentally someone who's disrupting the system in any meaningful sense. But far from being some upstart that's going to upend capitalism, that's going to give you a radically new way of doing things, Bitcoin, the majority of holdings today are, I mean, first of all, the second largest holder of Bitcoin on the planet is Tesla. The first largest, last time I looked, is something like JP Morgan. It's that kind of integration into the existing financial system is why this isn't working as a hedge, because instead of being something that's opposed to the financial system, it's part of the financial system. And if the financial system as a whole has a shock, then of course Bitcoin and every other cryptocurrency has a shock as well. And given there's a lot of these things are built on kind of extremely tenuous basis, the classic one being so-called stable coins, the idea with these being that you would have a cryptocurrency that maintains its parity, its value with typically the dollar on a one-for-one basis. So in other words, it's a really easy way for you to trade in Bitcoin over here, convert very rapidly into boring old fiat currencies like the dollar, and as long as that stable coin stays stable, then that relationship works. So it's the key link, or it's supposed to be the key link from crypto land into the rest of the economy. And those are the things that really collapsed Tether and a few others over the last few weeks. And they've collapsed because actually what happened was a great deal of speculation around them in classic fashion, and they reflect the pressures that are building up in the wider financial system around what's happening in the real economy. And what's really interesting, I think, is how that relates now to what is happening to some really core parts of what we do just to keep the economy moving at all. That if you start to consider why it is that avocado prices have picked up, there's a story here that starts to tell you something about what's happening in the rest of the economy. The first one is that, okay, prices started to pick up for US avocados from December from some fairly contingent reasons. I mean, there was a you start looking into what avocado farming, you realise you've entered a whole world of like unexpected sort of slight madness here. Avocados have risen in value so much, and demand for them really has picked up. You probably get the story here about millennials can't afford houses anymore because they're buying avocados, right? Demand really has picked up. Actually, not so much now in the US or Britain or Europe, but China, right? And places where you have a fast-growing middle class. I mean, there is some truth to this middle class consumption, not necessarily millennials really, but this demand has grown enormously. Demand has grown enormously, so to supply that demand, you find a great chunk of places that previously grew one kind of crop or sometimes just had forests, are cutting those crops down, deforesting rapidly in order to plant avocados. So deforestation in Mexico has averaged about 20,000 acres a year just for avocado growing over the last few years to meet that demand. And because it's a valuable cash crop, you find that people who are growing other valuable cash crops in Mexico get quite interested in avocado growing, and the reason the US slapped a ban on Mexican imports into the US back at the start of this year was that because their inspectors were getting threatened by some of the people growing avocados, right? So this is direct involvement, the allegation is of drug money effectively and drug cartels. That's the cash crop part of it. That's one part of it. The bit that also starts to set the increase in the avocado price upwards is that although avocado has this advantage in places like Kenya, it's been promoted as a hedge against climate change, that it's a crop you can grow all over the place. It doesn't need, if you try growing an avocado at home, they're actually quite hardy sort of creatures. They'll sit there and you can mistreat them a fair bit and they'll carry on doing their avocado thing. And then once you pluck them, you've got about 2 days to eat it before it's useless. But nonetheless, to grow the thing, that you can deprive them of a fair amount of water, or you can overwater them, or you can deprive them of a fair amount of heat, and they kind of carry on. So it's a hedge being promoted in places like Kenya against climate change. The climate is changing, it's harder to grow other kinds of crops, so grow avocados instead. Until extreme weather events of various sorts turn up, in this case in Kenya, and damage your harvest. Until you find that actually the pressure of water is so great that the supply of avocados, the harvests in South America in general, are being restricted or becoming restricted because of this. The forecasts are for the harvest to not meet up to expectations this year. That you have a whole set of these impacts built into this one crop, and that is starting to drive up the price. So in other words, what you're seeing here is that capitalism is directly related to climate change. On the causal side, you can see the impacts coming through here, but there's a feedback from climate change into how capitalism is operating as well. And so this is, I think, a conceptual challenge, which is what I wanted to spend a bit of time on. That we have, all of us, particularly on the left actually, I'd say, that we don't mean to do this, but we have a kind of model of the economy and of climate change in which we say something like, capitalism is causing climate change, so what we need to do is change how capitalism works, or perhaps just get rid of capitalism, and this will resolve climate change over on the other side of this. And typically this gets presented as a kind of, I think in two bad ways actually. One is a sort of as a catastrophic thing that will happen in the future. That we have, and you can pick however many years it is, we have 10 years to solve climate change. And I remember people saying this about 10 or 15 years ago, that you have 5 years to solve climate change. If you really want to try and frighten people, you go like, we've got basically 3 years to solve climate change. You can pick your kind of number here, and then we'll hit this point, and climate change can no longer be solved, right? And it's kind of, I think it's meant to act as a motivating factor for people. Frankly, subjectively, I think it's a demotivating factor because you go, well, what the hell are we going to do if it's all doomed? What's the point? But worse than that, I think it seriously underestimates what climate change is actually doing right now. Now, if you're in the global south, this is really obvious for great chunks of the world. If you're in Bangladesh, it's obvious. If you're on various South Pacific islands rapidly disappearing, this is just obvious. If you're in Greenland, it's quite obvious what's happening right now. So it's a relatively privileged position to say, oh, it will be catastrophic at some point in the future. This is affecting things right now. But it's also affecting the economy right now. It's also affecting how different parts of the economy interact with each other right now in a way that is feeding into what we are experiencing. So if we talk, most obviously in the developed world, about the cost of living crisis, this usually gets written down to a whole series of basically contingent factors, things that just sort of happen. And some of them are pretty contingent. There's a whole other story you can get into here. Russia invades Ukraine, right? And the two largest wheat exporters on the planet suddenly can't export so much wheat. So the price of wheat goes up. Now that's fairly contingent. There is a bigger story here that we won't go into, but it's fairly contingent. But then you get into the whole set of other reasons why it is that the prices of various goods going up. That you'd say, okay, well, coffee. Price of coffee's gone through the roof in the last year. Why has the price of coffee gone through the roof? Because in this case of extreme weather events and droughts and then floods in Brazil damaging coffee production. Or you go and look at what's happened to grain production in Canada, and again you find this combination of droughts. Or you go and see that, you know, one of the largest plagues of locusts ever recorded, where it was just sort of 18 months ago, through the Middle East and into East Africa. And this is just a thing that happens. And the trouble is, you keep getting all of these things that happen, that all of these extreme events keep happening. And the fact they keep happening is starting to impact on how the rest of us all live our lives, most obviously in the form of rising prices for a whole load of essential things. And this, by the way, this feeds into some pretty obscure, or at least unexpected, parts of the economy. It's not just agricultural products that are subject to this now. That if you take the semiconductor shortage, and semiconductors are you know, a fundamental part of what a modern economy does. You find silicon chips most obviously in electronic goods, but then you find them in cars, you find them appearing in, you know, fridges, you find them appearing in absolutely any place you can think of to put one and potentially generate, you know, all kinds of data out of this and monetize it and all sorts of other processes there. But nonetheless, fundamental to a whole load of parts of the world economy. And there's been a shortage for the last 18 months or so, really since the start of the first lockdown, which disrupted production on one side and then disrupted demand on the other. That's one part of it. But if you look at what has happened to one of the largest single manufacturers of silicon chips on the planet in the last year or so, which is Taiwan, and the droughts that Taiwan has been experiencing have affected the amount of water that silicon chip manufacturers can get. You need a huge amount of very pure water. You need to purify it to produce these chips. And if you have a drought, you don't get the water, you restrict production. And why are you having droughts? Well, again, you're back to this underlying process of climate change, of something that most of our conventional ways of thinking about the economy just don't really comprehend. That the environment is this passive object. And you can either be a very mainstream economist about this, and it's just not even something you really think about, or you can be a radical and you say, right, what we need is a Green New Deal. We have a passive object that's going to sit there for 5 years or 10 years, and we'll solve it, and then it will all be fine in the future. And in fact, it's not like that. But what you have now is the environment is no longer a passive object. The stable environment that we've all grown up with, that if you take the last sort of 200 years of industrial capitalism, perhaps a bit longer, that you had broadly, certainly since the end of the Little Ice Age and that period of cooling no later than the 1850s, you've had basically a warm and stable climate right the way through to, let's say, 1980, 1990. That the entirety of the industrial system that we built up in its capitalist form is built around the existence of an environment that doesn't actually change very much. That places that are warm yesterday will be warm today, will be warm tomorrow. Places that are cold, likewise, right? The kinds of crops you can go in certain places will be more or less stable. This has the property, by the way, that you can, if you want, just dump lots and lots of things onto that environment and it doesn't matter too much. You can absorb a lot because it's stable. Like if you want to grow more crops in places where it was previously difficult to do this, you can set up a huge chemical fertilizer process to make that possible. Or you can reclaim land and make that possible. You can put in place these big technical and social processes to generate from a stable environment in a reasonably uncomplicated fashion. You can, at the peak of this, set up supply chains for any goods you can think of that are being produced in the cheapest places you can find anywhere on the planet, that you're sailing or transporting otherwise the component parts of those things you want to make anywhere you like in the world, knowing that there is a stable environment for them to be sold into. that there is no problem with doing this in your world of globalization, because basically the Earth's just going to sit there and not do anything too much to disrupt you. Except what you see is happening is that the number of extreme weather events across the world is increasing markedly and has been for the last 20 or 30 years. That the rate of new disease crossover from animals into humanity is picking up quite markedly, that your expected rate of future pandemics is much higher than it used to be. That you then throw in just resource depletion. I mean, the peculiar one here that people don't quite pick up on, because there's a whole other story about, well, we want to decarbonize the economy, we want to deal with climate change. That's an incredibly resource-intensive process if you just think this is a technical switch. The copper, which is pretty well unavoidable if you want to decarbonize the economy because you're switching more and more things into using electricity, is in fact a scarce resource and in fairly short supply relative to expected future demand. So the price of copper goes haywire. That if you want to build batteries for all the electric cars that you are expecting to build to replace all the internal combustion engine cars that are out there at the minute, the rare earth metals for those car batteries, whether it's lithium or whatever it might be, can only be found in a few places on the planet, and they're fairly scarce supply. One of the places you can try and get this from is Greenland. And one of the reasons you can now get those resources there when you couldn't before is because the ice caps are melting, there's less ice around, and it's cheaper and easier to mine them. So there's a brewing conflict in Greenland and around the Arctic in particular around access to the resources there, which is most obviously oil and gas. Russia and others have got huge investments in Arctic oil and Arctic gas as liquefied natural gas from Siberia and from the Arctic, making its way into Europe right now. But also this includes the rare earth metals, of which Greenland is reckoned to be one of the largest depositories on the planet outside of China. There's then a third bit in this, is that having made all your exciting new products with the resources you've got, with the rare earth metals you've got, you then need to transport them to the market. And of course, what you find is that if the ice caps have melted, suddenly you have a nice new short sea route that goes over the top of the world that saves you having to sail all the way around it instead. In other words, the changing climate is also changing what capitalism does on every single level. It is no use thinking about a stable environment that we're just going to try and push into not push, we're just going to sort of protect it and change what we do, when in fact it's changing what happens to us already. And this is a serious, I'd say, epistemological problem for how we think of, not only in the mainstream of economics, where this stuff just doesn't enter as a conception of how the world operates, that you have the entire discipline built up. Effectively, modern economics is invented really in the late 19th century. But even its precursors to that, people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Karl Marx are working under the shadow of industrial capitalism, but they're working in this period of time of environmental stability. The presence of immense environmental instability and worsening instability doesn't feature in anybody's models. And that's one thing. We always say like conventional economics gets all of these things wrong. The mainstream models didn't understand in the run-up to the 2008 crash that if you have just immense amounts of debt being built up right the way across the world, but particularly in the developed world, I mean, most spectacularly actually amongst the larger economies in Britain, but then shortly followed by the US, pretty bad in Spain as well, related to property prices. Conventional models at the time said, it's fine, it doesn't matter if people have loads of debt, if lots of households have debt, because the prices of their houses are rising. So that kind of cancels out, what could possibly go wrong with this neat setup? And remember, in sort of 2006, this was presented as a perfectly reasonable way to think about the world without thinking two things, really. One is that your house price might just collapse at some point, which is in fact what happened, thus exposing all this debt. And the other thing is you have to roll that debt over, and at some point somebody might say you can't do that anymore, which is also what happened. The mainstream missed all this. They didn't get this, and they still haven't really got their heads around it. So it's one thing to say the mainstream of kind of economic thinking doesn't really understand like how the idea that everything just cancels out to create a stable world doesn't in fact apply in practice. That it matters how much debt you have. The total amount of debt you have matters. It's no good saying, I have a really expensive house, so does everybody else. that exposes you to potential risk on the house price. There's a similar thing that happens if you say, look, we can carry on producing economic growth. We can carry on using these resources as long as we become a bit more efficient at the top end of it. If you have a huge, great stack of resources you're already using, and there's a limit, or at least it becomes harder to get those resources, this is going to create problems. And then, of course, greenhouse gas, the emission side of that is the same thing. Yeah, the problem with the greenhouse effect and the problem with production of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases is that they're cumulative. So it's no good saying the rate at which we're pumping this stuff out is now slowing, and it kind of is for some processes. If you've already got a total stock that's enormous, that's going to be your problem. And that's the sort of fundamental, I think, of trying to understand what it is like to live in a world where there's this feedback into how we're behaving. But then there's another version of this, which I touched on, which comes up in a couple of different ways. One of them is this, what gets labelled now the Green New Deal, which has got very big in the US with people like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and a few other people, the more sort of radical end of the US left, promoting the idea that a hefty government investment will solve climate change. It's also become quite the thing in Britain to sort of think about climate change as this problem. And it's meant to act as a sort of inspirational moment that actually this is a problem that can be solved. This is something where we, in the form of the government, can intervene on a sufficiently large scale that will resolve this crisis. And sometimes people draw the direct comparison to World War II. You have this terrible problem, you mobilise the resources of society, you solve the crisis. That's one part of it. The other part of it is this implicit kind of Keynesian belief that what you really need to think about in the economy is not so much that, never mind what the environment's doing, is that we have an economy that's distorted by all these monetary factors that conventional economics doesn't really think about. The people who believe that, if you have loads of debt and an expensive house, it's probably not going to matter for anybody. Right? Okay, say the Keynesians. We can ignore that. We're the radicals. We know there's a problem with financialisation. If we solve the problem with financialisation, we'll make the real economy work properly and everything's going to be fine. So you get these two versions of a kind of reformist approach to resolving our various crises. Why is it that capitalism, say the Keynesians, or at least some of them, is quite so rapacious, quite so determinedly just driving into climate crisis to hell with everything else? It's because it's pushed on by this financial process. It's pushed on by the financial system. The financial system demands returns. It's completely volatile. It's completely chaotic. It will just push the rest of capitalism into trying to make as much value out of anything possible anywhere at all, including things like Bitcoin. I mean, it's just sort of nonsense, right? But you're trying to make money out of it. And this has this huge environmental consequence. Very obviously in the case of Bitcoin, it's very, very energy intensive to produce this stuff. It's about total Bitcoin energy consumption is 100 terawatt hours globally. And that's about 1/3 of the total data center consumption of the planet, right, is now roughly Bitcoin mining. So it's an incredible sort of environmental impact you get there. And it's the finance system that drives it on. So if you solve the finance system, the real economy can emerge in a much better state. And these are two sort of versions of it. One is, let's have a big government intervention that sort of says, okay, we're going to just rapidly decarbonise. We will get everybody in an electric car. We'll overhaul our entire energy system to get rid of coal, get rid of gas, have lots of solar, lots of wind. And we'll do that as quickly as possible. And that kind of resolve a great chunk of the crisis. And the other bit is, okay, we need to do something about finance as well. And then once we've done that, capitalism can emerge in a much more sort of human fashion. It's all going to be fine on top of this. The basic problem with both of these things, with all three of these different ways, I'd say, of looking at it, is that they centre on a particular issue in how we think of economics, which I think is directly related to the fact we've grown up generations now in an industrial economy in a stable environment where the centrepiece of how we think about the economy is basically what do we do as people. We're humans, we're great, we're going to do some stuff. So you get this anthropocentric view of how an economy functions. And that even if you start to say something like, as the conventional mainstream economics does, well, it's okay, we see that there's an environment out there and it's sort of externality. And maybe we want to look after it in some way and we'll kind of alter the economy here to deal with that environment. There's never the sense that the environment is in fact shaping us. And it's shaping all the various social processes that we're part of. Now, on a grand historical scale, you do find people who try and conceptualize the environment like this. Mike Davis's Late Victorian Holocaust, about the relationship between the El Nino Southern Oscillation, this big sort of multi-year swing in the temperatures of the Pacific Ocean into the Indian Ocean, and how it affected the climate in India and other parts of the British Empire, and the relationship between that and the British in imposing the empire and imposing mass starvation as a policy on India in particular, I think is a fascinating bit of how the environment shapes us. But if we're living in a time like now, the Anthropocene, as you know, the geologists like to call it, a point in which what we've done to the planet is so extraordinarily transformative that it deserves its own kind of geological time period. If we're living in a time like now, all of those long-term processes of how the environment relates to what people do are getting condensed. So in other words, everything you see around the cost of living crisis, or at least an extraordinarily large part of it, is the result of a big environmental process and instability that's speeding up, that we don't have the models in economics terms or the policies in sort of what do you do about this sense to really cope with. That because we have this intensely anthropocentric view of the world, that once we think about the economy, we just think about the people, and then everything else is secondary. It's a passive object that we work on, rather than something that will work on us and change what we're doing. We end up completely misfiring. We end up with, I mean, this, I'm sure this has been happening in Spain as well, but you end up with the governor of the Bank of England talking about how there's a danger of a wage price spiral, that wages will be too high and this will push up prices that everyone has to pay, and then people will demand more money for wages and then prices will go up. At the time, by the way, when wages are falling. You know, this is nonsense. But also, it's like, and he says, oh, people should exercise wage restraint. In other words, hold their wages down to prevent inflation. There is no, you can't cut wages enough for somebody working in a supermarket in London that it makes more coffee grow in Brazil, right? There's a kind of complete disjoint between the solutions that you talk about. Interest rates are the same thing. There's no interest rates that you can put the Bank of England base rate up to that will end a plague of locusts. It doesn't happen. Like, these things do not work. And that's an institutional failure, but it's also an intellectual failure. And it comes down to, I think, this sort of unfortunate but very well established tendency to just say, okay, we're the people, we are in charge of all of these processes, and that's the passive object we work on. And you can be very mainstream and say, oh, it's a wage price spiral or whatever, or you can be a radical and say, oh, we'll do a Green New Deal and it's all going to be fine. And either way, you end up with a failure, I think, to grasp the scale of the crisis that we're now in, and a failure to appreciate just how much all of this is now going to be irreversible. And it's going to require us to think about how to shape our own responses to a changing environment, rather than think through what do we do to impose ourselves on it, and how do we adapt to that. The most extreme version of this, of course, is geoengineering. That if you say, what is the most radical, dramatic, sort of transformative version of we're humans, we're going to impose ourselves on a passive planet, it is we can engineer the entire climate in order to suit what we want to get out the other side. Now, there are obvious reasons why this would in practice be an exceptionally bad idea, that the kind of unforeseen consequences of doing something like dropping iron filings in the Pacific Ocean to promote phytoplankton growth would have massive consequences for ocean life, or flying hydrogen balloons spraying sulfur out the back because it absorbs heat and light from the sun much more effectively than anything else. You know, these things have colossal and basically unknown consequences, but it's the most radical version of that way of thinking. And it comes out of that centering of the kind of us as people and everything else as a passive object. So what do we do about this? Where does this get us to? I think the mainstream in this, the mainstream of economic thinking, is basically facing an immense intellectual crisis. I realise I talk a lot about what are economists doing, because I'm an economist, right? And I can see them all running around talking about putting interest rates up, knowing full well that this will provoke a recession and do nothing about the underlying causes of inflation, yet they're still doing it. So this is an intellectual crisis of a scale, of a kind that Keynesianism ran into in the 1970s, the big sort of switch to neoliberalism. It's that kind of scale, and arguably I'd say probably quite a lot bigger. But there's a problem on the radical side in that we need to think a lot less about there's a crisis coming and much more about we're already in the crisis, right? The problem now is adaptation to the crisis, not how do you hold off this terrible thing that's about to befall us. And we should probably stop talking about it like that. That if we want to think about what our model for this should be, it's not how do we build utopia. It's not what would be this magical new world we're all going to get to if we just do the right things now. It's more like how do we build a life raft. It's more how do we cope with the fact things are falling apart and what are the plausible immediate solutions to that. And some of the things are quite simple. In the face of massive increases in prices of basic goods, which because capitalism does depend on this kind of financialized process where you can leverage the amount of money that you're making out of something because you borrow money to bet on it, or you're a huge, essentially close to a monopoly company. One of the major oil and gas producers, now massively profitable. You can just sit on top of these instabilities and make a huge profit out of it. But one of the demands I think to make is a very simple one about redistribution. That you squeeze those profits that are being generated out of the instability and you hand them back to everybody else. And there goes your cost of living crisis. There goes the crisis in real wages, of purchasing power. Over the longer term, I think there also then has to be a more detailed discussion on the left about adaptation and what a socially just adaptation looks like. And that isn't just a problem of saying, well, what do you do when Bangladesh floods much more often than it used to, or various Pacific islands are disappearing. It's also a problem of how do you secure food supplies in a world where these are subject to much more shocks than they used to be. And that probably is going to involve relocalization of food production. It's going to involve relocalization of production in general. It's probably going to involve looking beyond food, things like understanding that the electronic gadgets that we get pushed to buy on a conveyor belt, probably the future can't really look like this, and we're going to have to think more about how you reuse and recycle and reprogram them. That parts of the circular economy have to be integrated more closely into how we think about what this life raft looks like in the end. So I'll just wrap up on this point. I don't think there's any... The problem that you say all this is there's no real reason to sit here and say it's all going to be fine. What it looks like is things are just going to get worse. Right? There isn't, if you look at the climate modelling of this, there's nothing in there that says this will all be okay. There's a chance it's sort of okay, but mostly it's just going to get worse. If things are going to get worse, this is going to change how we all behave and how the economy operates. If that's going to happen, we need to update how we respond to it to take account of the fact of that feedback. That we need to understand ourselves as no longer sort of godlike creatures able to impose ourselves on the planet and nothing really happens, but instead understand ourselves in a relationship with nature and with a changing nature and developing a socially just, a sustainable program out the other side of that. And I'll finish on that point.
Pasamos a las preguntas. Tenéis que hablar a los dos micrófonos a la vez. Sé que es una cosa un poco extraña, pero es lo que hay que hacer. Entonces, no sé si alguien quiere empezar. Como siempre, la gente nos anima al principio. Bien.
Mi percepción de los economistas mainstream, ¿no?, es un poco como de que, o sea, como de deshonestidad intelectual, ¿no? Como que les parece como muy bien bajar los impuestos y muy mal invertir en lo público, y no sé muy bien cómo se ve esto desde la otra parte de los economistas, que a lo mejor nos... O sea, no sé cómo se entiende esta deshonestidad intelectual, o lo que yo percibo como deshonestidad intelectual, cómo se percibe desde el otro lado de la barrera. No sé si soy yo que no lo entiendo o son ellos que son, no sé, muy fachas, no sé, no lo entiendo.
¿Alguien más? ¿Le dejamos contestar?
Yo tengo una pregunta que va en el sentido de, en tu charla has lanzado la idea general de pues, romper un poco ese dualismo hombre-naturaleza y dejar de pensarnos como desde esa perspectiva divina que no tiene límites en el entorno, etc. Y optar por otra. Entonces, mi pregunta es, desde concretándolo en modelos o teorías económicas o autores o nombres, o cuál es el marco para analizar pues estas cuestiones más concretamente, más allá de hay que romper ese dualismo, cómo se hace, qué nombres, qué autores, qué marcos, porque claramente incluso, no sé, cosas que no son mainstream en cierto sentido, como la misma teoría de Marx, es de algún modo ciega a los límites del entorno, en cierto sentido. Bueno, esa es la pregunta.
Shall I come back? Sorry,
Yeah, if you want to answer those.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, thank you for both. On the first one, on mainstream economists, I mean, the challenge you have typically is that they are intellectually honest. Like, people really believe this stuff. They're sort of deeply convinced. And they'll sustain that belief even in the face of things not working. I mean, what you saw out of 2008, the crash and afterwards, was a realization that the core, the pinnacle economic models that people had, the ones that had the most sophisticated maths, the ones that were supposed to be the absolute, this is just how economics is done now. The arrogance, by the way. I mean, Robert Lucas, who won the fake Nobel Prize for economics back in 2006, said, oh, well, we've solved the fundamental problems of macroeconomics now. And that's only 2 years before the shit really hit the fan. I mean, there was a real sort of belief, self-belief. We get into 2008, and it's a point where even the Queen was asking, how did you not realise that this wasn't going to work, famously, at the LSE. And there was a bit of sort of coughing and shuffling and wondering what to do, and a certain amount of soul-searching. But actually, if you look 10 or more years later, it's had some impact. Like, there's a sort of recognition that perhaps not everything works all the time, but the core of the subject remains the same in the mainstream. It hasn't really moved that much. And it's quite a lot of self-sustaining belief that's involved there. And there's all sorts built into that. I think there's a genuine sort of belief that people have. There's an intellectual coherence to the mainstream, which people shouldn't underestimate, that once you have like the majority of the world's universities teaching this and lots of people beavering away to make this work, it's kind of big and imposing, it's going to sit there, and it's hard to dislodge that. And then, of course, there's just the institutional supports of it, that if you talk like this, you can get a well-paid job at a bank. Like, I say that, actually, I mean, some of the more interesting people out there have well-paid jobs at banks because their role is to say what's actually happening rather than give you a kind of ideological version of what's happening. But that's the sets of institutions there, so it hasn't moved very much. What's so striking right now is that in 2008 there was a sort of, I'm just comparing the two crises, in 2008 there was a recognition that the models didn't work and therefore you had to change the model. What's so dramatic now, I think, is that there's no recognition the model doesn't work, it's just the model isn't working. So you're just going to carry on saying the same stuff about a wage price spiral, about how we have to put up interest rates, without even a conception that this isn't working. It's just the thing you do. It's like you are turning yourself into a priest at this point. You're just kind of doing the ritual, right? Whether it does anything, whether there's a God there or not, it really doesn't matter. You're still just going to do the ritual. So that feels to me like a more profound intellectual crisis. And I think in Britain, I think it'll play out over the next sort of 6, 7, 8 months or so as it becomes obvious we're going to end up in a recession. I would have thought fairly soon, because everything's really expensive and nobody can buy anything, right? So if you go into this and say what we need to do is cut wages and put up interest rates, that isn't going to be sustainable. So they're going to hit a real problem, I think, before the end of the year. Similarly with much of the developed world, I think it's going to be a similar thing. But it feels like a deeper crisis in 2008. And that, I think, is partly related to the fact that it is a deeper crisis. 2008 was a crisis of the financial system that turned into a crisis of the wider economy. This is a crisis of the environment that we live in that is turning into a crisis of the real economy. They'll probably turn into a financial crisis down the line. The mechanism is much more deeply embedded in like how we live our lives. That means it's worse and serious, much more serious. But it's also serious with like the ideology, the intellectual conceptions that people have about what's happening. On the second one, right, okay, a general idea, breaking the general idealism of man and nature, yes. Stop thinking about the infinitude of the environment was the translation, so it's sort of plenitudes. It's just an immense world of riches, a cornucopia, whatever that is. Maybe it is a Spanish word, but anyway, it's that you can just go out and just take whatever you want from. And there's a vision of socialism that basically says what it will be like under socialism is that literally everyone will have like a Lamborghini, you know, and it'll just be great because it'll all be equal and we'll just have whatever we want all the time. I mean, I quite like the book, and I like Aaron too, but Aaron Bastani's fully automated luxury communism is the kind of pinnacle of this. It's like, well, it's okay, we'll just mine some asteroids and then we'll all be so rich that, you know, you can all just have whatever luxury car you want. And the truth is that it almost certainly it can't really look like this. Like, leaving aside whether sort of morally or ethically or some deeper sense of whether just consuming loads of stuff is actually going to make us happy. I don't want to turn into too much of a hippie about this, but you know, there's probably a sense in which maybe not. But beyond that, there are kind of hard limits that we're going to run up against, and we are running up against. And if this point about instability, if what the environmental models tell us, which is the world is getting more unstable. All the economic models, by the way, I didn't really get into this. Mainstream economic models assume stability all the time. It's built in. You have a shock, and the shock goes away, and then you're back to stability. The environmental models don't work like that. So there's going to be that's your intellectual problem. This is affecting the thing you're trying to model with your economic model. But your economic model has a built-in assumption that if you have something happen, it will just go back to normal. The argument here is that you'll never go back to normal. There is no normal to return to. So if you have a vision of socialism that says everything for everybody, well, everything for everybody is not a bad sort of demand, but if everything for everybody means like literally we're all just immensely materially wealthy, this probably isn't going to quite be how things work out. So I think that needs to be, we need to sort of walk away from versions of socialism which are strongly productivist, that will transform the entire world, that will just produce everything we want for everybody. That line from Trotsky about, oh, we'll just move mountains around if we want to. I mean, it's like this sort of, the world is completely passive and we'll just do whatever we want to it, I think is worth getting away from. I think there are ideas and sort of theoretical understandings around this within economics, within what we normally think of as economics, that get you to some parts of that. I think the work of various ecological economists, and in particular the idea, I don't think this tells you everything, but the idea that the energy supplies, treating the economy as a sort of energetic system. So it's a physical process like every other physical process. So you supply energy into it and there will be losses as a result of that. You can't have a perpetual motion machine. Again, because it's kind of 19th century heritage, mainstream economics basically says the economy is a perpetual motion machine. In fact, it says it's better than that. It's a perpetual motion machine that will grow forever. Right, so it's a perpetual motion machine that will get faster and faster and faster. Ecological economics would argue quite hard that the energetic demands of making that system work are so great that it cannot just grow forever and ever and ever, right? So that's a useful insight there, if combined with the stuff about resources. I think your third element here is somebody you touched on, who actually I think is very important to all of this, which is Karl Marx, who is seriously underappreciated as a sort of early ecologist. That his writings on the relationship between agriculture, the industrialization of agriculture and the supply of food to cities, and in particular what that supply of cheap food would then do to wages that people get in those cities, which doesn't really make it into capital, but he's got his various notebooks and things. John Bellamy Foster, I think, has done a very good job of sort of excavating some of this work, talking about what he calls the metabolic rift between society and nature. In other words, this energetic system that in non-industrialized, non-capitalist societies is relatively sort of balanced, like the interchange of nutrients from the soil, energy from one source to another source is actually fairly in balance. Capitalism interrupts that dramatically. And it takes a while for these consequences to build up, but now we're living with these consequences. I mean, people, early industrialization, nobody knew that if James Watt didn't know that if you invent the steam engine, in 200 years' time, you have catastrophic floods in Bangladesh, right? It wasn't part of the scientific conception available at the time. It is now, and I think that gives you the final element of this, which is that there's a need for taking the idea of science and knowledge and technology and applying it to all of this, but doing so in a way that it is under the direct control of the kind of the people, the democracy, the wider set, the collective, rather than the institutions of science as they are now being monopolised by very large profit-producing institutions or institutions closely allied to them and their interests. So there's also this kind of plank in here that we have to crack open some of these things. We saw this very dramatically in COVID around the debate over patents for vaccines. You know, it doesn't solve everything, but it gets you a great deal down the line towards having a fairer distribution of vaccines to have patents that are available to everyone to use and produce generic versions. Instead, you had monopolisation of those things. Not even that they were necessary. I mean, some of the companies are all like, oh, we're giving away our profits from this. But they had to maintain the system of profit making that was based on the patents, because they know if you undermine it here, it starts to undermine it for everything else. So that, I suppose, is a slightly long-winded set of answers there. But I think there's enough that's already there to pull this together and make it work. But it involves like ditching a few sort of, killing a few sacred cows on the socialist movement to get there.
Vale, yo tengo unas, pero si os animáis podéis ir antes que yo. Estupendo, así lo hace Héctor.
Bueno, muchas gracias James por la charla. Yo tenía una pregunta que es dos en realidad, que es cuando has hablado de la muerte del neoliberalismo, bueno, la muerte, el fin del neoliberalismo, y lo que implica las inestabilidades que produce el cambio climático, me preguntaba cómo te imaginas que son las consecuencias a nivel económico y también político de digamos, de esa inestabilidad, ¿no? Por ejemplo, o sea, estar permanentemente metido en un sistema económico con alta inflación de costes y bajo crecimiento, ¿no? Y qué implicaciones tiene eso, digamos, o sea, alta inflación de costes por aumentos de coste de energía, de materiales, el fin de la naturaleza barata hasta que dicen, etcétera, ¿no? Y en segundo lugar, cómo esa situación te puede llevar a una revolución teórica en la economía, ¿no? O sea, que Keynes responde a los aumentos brutales del desempleo, digamos, en la Gran Depresión. La revolución neoliberal es una respuesta al fracaso, digamos, al fin del keynesianismo clásico, bueno, o sea, de la curva de Phillips. Y entonces, digamos, ¿qué economía puede salir de ahí y cómo se hace? Porque en realidad cuando hace Keynes la revolución keynesiana, Keynes está muy metido en el mainstream, no es un tío radical desde fuera, digamos, ¿no? O sea, es un pensador, tiene una parte como de alguien que está en el sistema y en el mainstream económico, quiero decir, y sale un poco de ahí, ¿no? Y me preguntaba también, o sea, ¿cómo puede pasar esa transición, digamos, para que haya un fin de la ideología neoliberal que al final, digamos, nos permita como abrir nuevas formas de ver y nuevas políticas públicas, ¿no?
Creo que es lo que has dicho de que el capitalismo presupone, ¿no?, la estabilidad climática y ecológica es completamente cierto y que es algo que seguramente afecte, ¿no?, como ha preguntado Héctor, o esperemos que afecte a la teoría económica mainstream. Creo que también es cierto que como que la tradición socialista, ¿no?, de lucha del movimiento obrero también hasta cierto punto asumía eso, y como que no era problemático la cuestión de la abundancia y que podíamos avanzar a una sociedad, ¿no?, como que el problema era el capitalismo que impedía que tuviésemos suficiente para todos, etcétera, etcétera. Yo creo que estas dos cosas son ciertas. Creo que hay una forma, ¿no?, de pensamiento, de adaptación a esto desde los entornos radicales que es como un socialismo un poco contenido, ¿no?, como consciente de esta relación ahora problemática con la naturaleza, que en algunas cosas vamos a tener que ser como más autolimitarnos, que algunas cosas no vamos a poder tenerlas todos, ¿no?, como el coche personal o este tipo de cuestiones, o cambios en la dieta, cosas que hemos hablado durante el seminario. Entonces yo creo que esto es cierto. Mi pregunta es, a nivel político, ¿cómo consigues que este tipo de mensaje sea un mensaje atractivo para la gente, ¿no? ¿Cómo podemos conjugar el hecho de que es posible que en las próximas décadas las cosas vayan relativamente peor, ¿no?, o cada vez sea más complicado hacer ciertas cosas, con un movimiento político, un programa que pueda ser capaz, ¿no?, de aunar mayorías, de ganar poder en los estados, en los sindicatos, en todos los lugares. Y Y me gustaría que si quieres o si te apetece, ¿no? o si tiene sentido unirlo, lo enlaces con el trabajo que hicisteis durante Corbyn en el Green New Deal, porque me parece que fue una experiencia hasta cierto punto, ¿no? de intentar hacer atractiva una transición, ¿no? hacia un tipo de economía más sostenible y que se adapte mejor al cambio climático y los retos que tenemos por delante, ¿no? Y ya está.
Okay. Wow. These are all quite big questions, but yeah, how does, all right, so we talk about the death of neoliberalism, and it's not dead yet, but it's dying, right? I think that's probably, and also you say people, oh, neoliberalism's dying, and they get very excited. Sometimes people don't necessarily, no, I was going to say something mean, but like you have to make this leap of imagination to think of something worse than neoliberalism. And surely it's not that hard to think of things that are worse than neoliberalism, right? I can, off the top of my head, name a few things that would definitely be worse. But people go like, oh, well, if it's dying, why isn't everything better? And it's like, at what point, if you're on the left in the last 40 years, did you expect anybody to turn up and just make things better for you? This relates to the Jeremy Corbyn problem, which I'll come back to in a second. But there is a deeper issue in two parts on this that you touched on. I agree with you that if you take the Keynesian Revolution, so-called, so coming out of the 1930s, and by the way, it kind of took a massive war to get to that revolution on the other side. So let's not get too, carried away about the purely intellectual parts of this. But certainly by the 1950s, Keynes himself, or his writings in the general theory, have been kind of defanged somewhat and turned into a relatively safe set of principles about how to run, at the time, a modern capitalist economy. And you're right to say that Keynes was himself already part of the mainstream and then kind of converted. But it's also the case that the mainstream at that time was far broader than what you'd anticipate now. Like if you go and dig out, I don't recommend anyone does this, but if you go and dig out economics journals from the 1920s, 1930s, you find a great range of people writing in all sorts of different theoretical traditions. If you get the Quarterly Journal of Economics, then you'll find any number of, a few, not that many, but a few Marxists, a few people writing in more sort of heterodox traditions, institutional economists of various sorts. If you go and dig out the Quarterly Journal of Economics now, it's just fairly dull maths for page after page after page, all of which gets the same conclusion, which is, people optimise and markets are good, with rare exceptions. So the mainstream was bigger. So economics as a discipline was less sort of shut off to the rest of the outside world at that point in time. If you look at who was in the Cambridge Economics Department with Keynes, I mean, it's incredible. Michal Koletsky was there for a bit, Piero Sraffa, Gramsci's sort of great, the guy who collected Gramsci's prison notebooks was there as part of this intellectual conversation. It's not like that now, very substantially not like that now. And there are a few sort of outposts where it might look a bit like that, but it's not really part of the conversation. So I think economics itself is in a worse place than it was. It's worse able to deal with the kind of shocks. And the shock that we're talking about, I think, is worse than the revision that was needed to create Keynesianism. The collapse of the earlier liberal economy, centred on the pound sterling, with the City of London, the organising heart of financial hegemony across the world. This is me doing Giovanni Arrighi's sort of long 20th century bit. But when you had that hegemonic power, when you had a liberal way of organising the world economy, large amounts of trade, minimal state intervention, which hits a series of crises from the early 20th century onwards, and that aren't really resolved until really after the Second World War, that is one form of a problem which could be solved in practice by, for instance, radically increasing the rate of exploitation of nature in the form of using oil, switch from oil to coal, for example. And that helps deliver growth and a period of stability, particularly in the West, for that period of time, which then itself runs into crisis for all sorts of various reasons without getting too much into this. The replacement of that is neoliberalism, which also increases the exploitation of nature, expands massively the domain of the world market after 1989, partly Eastern Europe, but mostly really China, and then starts to hit at the end of that point like a series of barriers that it can't overcome. Firstly, in the financial system, the creation of debts that basically realistically, units and households in the system can't repay, businesses can't repay, so you built up too much debt, and then it hits this ecological barrier. And it's the ecological barrier that looks like this is a far deeper crisis with fewer obvious solutions than you ran into that got you Keynesianism. Not that you have world wars, obviously, but in terms of what are the solutions to this, what are the things lying on the ground to get you somewhere? Like, you're going to have to think much more deeply about how the economy operates. There isn't a sort of free gift of, almost free gift of very cheap oil that you can turn rapidly into, you know, consumer goods of various sorts, or actually a build-up of technology from the Second World War that feeds into this. There isn't the free gift for neoliberalism of suddenly China's entered the world market, effectively. There isn't a second China, there isn't another load of oil that we can plausibly use. These things don't exist. So there isn't the solution in practical terms, and it's hard to see what the intellectual response to that would be, particularly from the mainstream. And they may well not come up with one. And there's at least a plausible bit where economics sort of dies as a useful, it's not that useful necessarily, but dies as a functioning discipline because it simply cannot handle the range of questions that it gets confronted with. But yes, I think you're right. You mentioned the end of cheap nature. I think this is, I think it's Jason Moore. Yeah, it is Jason Moore who is a Marxist, actually. I think he'd probably call himself that of some sort. Yeah, who coined this idea that capitalism grew because it had access to cheap resources of various sorts. Right? This is the entire process of building capitalism, is you just get cheap things. So building an empire, various empires are built, it's just massive resource extraction, which includes, you know, slavery, for instance, so resource extraction process there. But then you hit the period of cheap labor, which is, you know, you can just employ millions of people in China and not pay them very much, and you build loads of stuff, and that runs for a bit. You get to the end of this as a serious problem. Now, I think with Jason Moore's work, he's right to some extent. The bit that he somewhat misses is the flip side of what does capitalism do, which I think Andreas Malm's very good, but probably overstated, but it's very good book, Fossil Capital, gets into, which he has this fascinating story of how early industrialization, which we all think of, oh, it's just burn loads of coal, make factories burning coal, steam-powered, produce cotton in Manchester. That if you compare the price of coal and production of coal and the use of coal in steam-powered factories at the time, it was really a lot cheaper just to use water, right? So you build a water wheel, that would be cheaper than trying to dig coal, transport it, burn it, all that sort of stuff. And the reason this doesn't happen is that you can control coal and you can control the people who are using that coal in a way that it's much harder to control what happens to a water wheel, because it depends on what nature does. And you have to locate, not in big towns, where you can corral everyone together and here's your industrial proletariat. You have to have people who are fairly independent operating the thing. So in other words, it's sacrificed cheap, which is water wheel, for control. And there's a degree to which I think part of the issue now is that capitalism in the past has definitely sacrificed cheap for more control over the process. But if you look at what's happening around sort of digital technologies in particular, these things aren't necessarily very cheap, and they're not even necessarily very profitable. But they do give you that kind of access to control, and you can control and manage and attempt to steer a process, which in a world of instability is quite a useful thing. So you push harder and harder into the digital technologies because it gives you at least a semblance of control in some various different forms. And it allows you to do something to all of us, really, which is a bit like, you know, going off to the Congo and tapping rubber or digging silver from mines in South America, which is that you can dig into people's psyches and try and monetize some of that. I mean, that's what the technology does. So it opens up sort of new frontiers of nature to exploit at that point as well. So that's the kind of mix, I think, of solutions that they get to, right? Practical on-the-ground stuff is increased versions of control, which would very likely include, and this is the death of neoliberalism, include versions of state control and state power being asserted. I've forgotten his name, unfortunately. The Climate Leviathan is a particularly good sort of read on this. The idea that you will just end up with a very big, very powerful state that attempts to manage a world in which the climate has changed and there's a deep environmental instability. So just some big authoritarian power imposes itself on that world of instability is one sort of version of the future. And that would match up very neatly with the private capital attempt to sort of monetize the various data collection technologies that we have. So that's what looks worse than neoliberalism, by the way. If you get to this, you'd be saying, I wish we had Margaret Thatcher back again. That's what That's what people will be saying. On the second one, right, hang on. It's another big question. Yeah, and it's also like, that's all well and good, but people want cars, and that's quite reasonable actually to want a car. I think there's this challenge that it's a split in the left, or broadly defined, between exactly that kind of version of socialism, in particular the labour movement, where it's actually the problem is the distribution of material goods, and we should get more material goods, and there should be an expanding range of material goods, and another bit of it which is like, actually you should all want to like read poetry to each other, or sit in meetings like this, you know, that kind of thing. That's much more improving than driving a fast car, right? So there's a kind of, and I really don't like the moralism associated with the hair shirt, why don't the workers just buy less sort of version of this, right? I think it's absolutely the death of the left to try and end up like this, and it's why, for example, your political enemies try and portray what you're doing as versions of that you want to deprive people of things. The problem that we were up against is that the solution to that kind of dilemma in the past has always been for the labour movement and the socialist movement, and certainly the social democratic part of that movement, to say something like, we will just get you loads of growth. That once you have loads of growth, the problem, the distribution of material resources doesn't matter so much, because the economy is growing, so everyone gets a bit more, right? And you're all going to be fine. Like, you may be poor now, but with the economy growing, eventually you'll probably be a bit better off, right? And maybe that'll be faster, maybe it'll be slower, but it will happen. If you're in a world where growth is really constrained by all these sort of big environmental factors, by the fact your technology doesn't really produce growth anymore, all sorts of things, that isn't a solution at all. So you're going to have to start to talk. I mean, there might be a version of this where you just go, well, there's no growth, so we all have to put on hair shirts and do like noble improving things. Or you lean really hard, and this is my version of the solution, into that redistributive tradition in the labour movement, and you say, look, this is an immensely wealthy world we live in. We've created, just in the last few years, I mean, thanks to the pandemic, a huge number of new billionaires. There's inane articles speculating about whether Elon Musk, I'm sorry to drag him back in again, but whether Elon Musk will be the world's first trillionaire. And wouldn't that be great? You know, but there's an immense amount of wealth out there on a scale that is profoundly hard for people to conceptualize. I mean, usually if you ask someone, imagine someone rich, you can get someone down the road from in a slightly bigger house. It's like, at this point, you have to imagine someone rich. Imagine someone so rich they've earned more money than you and everybody you know and everybody you'll ever meet will earn in their entire lifetime, times like 10, 20, 30, right? It's monumental scale of wealth. So if you want a version of like, what does a sort of admitting that things are bad, and that they're not necessarily going to get better in a material sense, like this is going to be hard. A version of that is simply to say, look, we need redistribution on a much more thoroughgoing scale than has been attempted inside Europe, really, before. I mean, there's been some. You can read Piketty, you can see what happened in the last sort of 100 years or so. But now, without the luxury of that additional growth, we're just going to have to lean quite hard into redistribution. So we are going to have to find incredibly wealthy people and take things away from them. We will not have the first trillionaire, because we're going to take Elon Musk's wealth away from him, right? And then redistribute it. And that gets you a long way towards thinking about what a solution looks like to some of this. Because you're still saying there can be material rewards. You're still saying there's a material like improvement in your standard of living. It's just you're no longer having to sit there and go like, oh, well, we'll grow so I don't have to think about this. No, we are going to have to think about this. We have to work out how to make this happen. And that's politics, I think, that you get to on this.
Yo tenía dos preguntas sobre dos temas que has comentado. Igual está muy relacionado con las cosas que se acaban de preguntar, pero bueno. Una era cuando comentabas, que me parece muy interesante el hecho de que tanto el mainstream económico como teorías o planteamientos tipo el Green New Deal consideran a la naturaleza como un objeto sobre el que puedes actuar, y has hablado sobre ello, y que tendremos que pensar más en cómo hacer la adaptación al cambio climático de manera socialmente justa, ¿no? Aún así, o sea, creo que eso es muy interesante y probablemente sea un correctivo igual a como venimos pensando hasta ahora desde una parte de izquierda, pero aún así entiendo o creo que hay cosas que se pueden hacer para intentar pues, si vamos a vivir en un mundo de caos climático, mitigarlo y que sea lo menor posible, ¿no? E intentar, pues siguen estando no abandonar, digamos, entiendo, los objetivos pues, del IPCC o de otro tipo de reducción de emisiones. Entonces, a ese respecto, por ejemplo, pregunta concreta, respecto a esta idea del Green New Deal siempre, ¿no? De como la última inversión, ¿no? Del último impulso, ¿qué piensas respecto a ello dentro del contexto de lo que nos has planteado? Y luego, respecto a las utopías, que es algo que aquí siempre nos gusta mucho, como puedes ver en los carteles que están detrás. Creo que también es interesante el hecho de no concebir utopías como en el sentido de una receta muy concreta de cómo queremos que sea el mundo, ¿no? Justo por lo que has comentado, pero si crees que aún así hay una parte, por ejemplo, yo creo que es bastante utópico en el buen sentido de pues que vamos a robarle las cosas a Elon, ¿no? Entonces, si crees que en ese sentido si sigue habiendo como un potencial utópico, aunque para contrarrestar o llevar mejor el saber que vamos a vivir en un mundo bastante terrible a nivel político, o si crees que no, que hay que intentar como ir muy como medida a medida sin, digamos, un panorama, un horizonte político más alejado en el tiempo y más amplio. Ya está. Gracias.
Lo primero, siento mucho que tengas que debatir con sacerdotes y no científicos, bueno, científicos, sino no economistas, en el aspecto teórico. Lo que yo quiero hacer una pregunta, porque estamos hablando mucho de la academia, ¿no? Y como eres británico y tienes allí la City de Londres, y estos fondos de inversión, estas consultoras, toda esta gente, les gusta mucho también sacar estudios. Con menos rigor, podemos debatirlo. Tengo constancia, porque lo tengo descargado, de que un fondo de inversión tenía uno de sus jefes de investigación, que era economista no sé dónde, habló hace ya unos cuantos años de la que se nos venía encima. Era un fondo de inversión pequeñito. Y lo largaron. El documento es bastante interesante, la verdad. Entonces, quiero preguntar sobre estos acólitos de los sacerdotes. ¿Qué plantean? ¿Qué proponen? Es decir, ¿están haciendo como la orquesta del Titanic, tocar hasta que llegue y al estilo de los científicos de, creo que fueron Shell, cuando Alexandro Ocasio-Cortez les preguntó, sabemos lo que estamos haciendo, pero nos da absolutamente igual, el dinero manda? ¿O tienen un plan B, que va a ser un mundo peor que el neoliberalismo, como ya habéis comentado? Y después, sobre lo de redistribuir la riqueza, me parece maravilloso, evidentemente, creo que es la solución, y ser vegano hasta que podamos pillar y comernos a Elon Musk. Pero la gente está adoctrinada. Bueno, está mal hablar así, ¿no? Pero quiero decir, la gente tiene metido en la cabeza la meritocracia, tiene metido en la cabeza, es que si me dan, ¿por qué voy a trabajar? Y aquí, a lo mejor, si estoy equivocado o es estúpido lo que digo, me puedes tirar la botella, si fuese de plástico, sí, es que es de vidrio. Entonces, ¿cómo se plantearían incentivos nuevos para estas personas? Que no dicen, no, mira, te vamos a redistribuir, tú tranquilo. No. Ese tema, ¿no? La creación de incentivos en un mundo en el que se va a redistribuir y vas a estar más tranquilo. Y poco más. Muchas gracias.
Yeah, the first one on the, and I realise I didn't pick up on your own question about the Green New Deal, so I'll try and get these two together on the Green New Deal and not abandoning the idea of adaptation. I mean, there are lots of different versions of the Green New Deal. It's quite an expansive sort of concept. The version that we ended up with when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. So I worked for John McDonnell, who was Shadow Chancellor, sort of Jeremy's, closest sort of collaborator or whatever the word would be. Comrade, there we are. So I worked for him until late 2018. And the version of the Green New Deal that's presented in the 2019 general election was trying to do something like, we can decarbonise the energy system in Britain very, very rapidly. And if you were to just do this as government, these are the steps you'd have to do. And it's quite an interesting document. It's called 30 by 30, because the idea was you get to, I'm trying to think, it was, by 2030, it would be 30% of existing emissions and some target like this. It was a radical, dramatic improvement on the current target, which is 2050, so it's another 20 years on. So, and it kind of lays out the scientific plan on how you might do this and what parts of the economy have to move and this sort of thing. And it's written in such a way that you can look at it and go like, oh, well, if we do this, nothing much actually has to change, right? We can kind of carry on going to work every day, but now we'll be an electric car. Or we can carry on going on holiday, maybe a few flights, maybe we'd just take slightly longer to get there, but basically it'll be very, very similar lives to what we've done already. But we've got this great sort of techno-scientific solution that will just rapidly decarbonise the energy system in Britain, which is only one part of the whole set of problems you actually want to solve, because what about biodiversity loss? What about the fact touched on that if you want to decarbonise transport rapidly, actually that means doing a lot of public transport, which it does have built in, but it's a heavy demand for batteries and therefore a heavy demand for the resources you need to make those batteries, and that's a whole other set of questions that you immediately run into. The kind of the state-led technology-based solution to this doesn't necessarily get you very far apart from one dimension only of the whole set of crises. And you're selling people this thing where the government has the capacity to do this, which I think is frankly pushing things. Like, this is a huge plan, and you know, the British government does not have the capacity to do very much, as we've all discovered over the last few years. This is the side effect of neoliberalism. We've hollowed out the entire state, and then you turn around and say, by the way, can you do the most ambitious program of energy transformation ever attempted by any developed country? And off you go, civil service, do your best. You know, it's sort of implausible. So a program has to involve changes to how we live our lives. And that's actually can be a good thing. Because I think if you start saying, well, if it's changes to how we live our lives, if we're also thinking about this problem of adaptation, then part of that adaptation might well be something fairly simple like working fewer hours, which we know very, very well has a solid impact on carbon emissions, basically because you're using less transport and you're just using less office space and this sort of thing. And as we discovered in the course of COVID, and I wouldn't suggest that, you know, we want to go back to lockdowns and this sort of thing, but as we discovered, it has also got an adaptation purpose, simply because you're kind of avoiding contact with other people in this case. So you can start to align different parts of how this might work if you take a more holistic view than just that very technocratic, it's a bit unfair, but basically technocratic version of the Green New Deal. And I think the temptation to try and present it to people as, actually, this is a win-win, nothing much will change in your lives, really. We'll just be a bit greener and nicer. I think we need to push quite hard against that and say, actually, your lives will be different. Like, you won't work so many hours, and you will like that. We know you like that, because everyone says they want to do that. And that's good. So we'll do that. And we'll change how our towns and cities are organised, so it's a lot easier to walk to places. And we'll start to think much more broadly about the set of things we could do to make that happen, rather than just like, let's focus on decarbonisation as the primary goal of everything here, because it cannot be anymore. It just can't be. So that, I think, is how you start to align those two things. I hope it picks up on your question about the Green New Deal. The other set was trying to be positive, and then I'll come back to that maybe, and then and then also, what are the economists doing, right? Do they have a B plan? Is it going to be worse than neoliberalism? I don't like the story about neoliberalism, because I think it's sort of meant to be helpful but basically isn't, where it goes like, Keynesianism was there, things were sort of fine, then it hit a crisis, and then like Milton Friedman turned up and told everyone to be a neoliberal, and Margaret Thatcher listened to him, and then we had neoliberalism. Like, there's a sort of condensed version of that story, which it's a better book than I just caricatured, but Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, I think, does a version of that. It's like, there's a crisis, and these people just had some ideas lying around, and they just went out and implemented it, and that's it. The only place I can think of that really looks like that, properly, that you see it from one end to the other, is Iraq. And that's like, because you invaded the place, you impose it. Everywhere else is, you get some elements of this, Russia, Eastern Europe in general, but by the time you get down the end, you end up somewhere else. Like, there's lots and lots of other things happening. It's not possible to have a crisis unless you've invaded somewhere, got rid of the government, killed its former political leadership, driven everybody else out of that government, and then try to impose something. It's not usually possible to just go, here's our ideas, let's go and do it, right? It doesn't, or your Pol Pot, I mean, that's the other sort of option here. So it's not usually possible to do that, and it isn't how neoliberalism developed. That if you take, outside of a few exceptional cases, it's very, very piecemeal in its early years. Well, actually, it doesn't start in Britain with Margaret Thatcher. It gets going under the Labour government previously. In France, it's not even a government to the right, it's Mitterrand. You know, there's actually similar stories across Europe for that. The piecemeal effort to construct this with people who had some parts of ideas and argued bits of their case and had an idea of roughly where they wanted to get to, I think is part of that story. The same thing with China. Isabella Weber's book about the Chinese reform process. The construction of neoliberalism there wasn't, as per Naomi Klein, Milton Friedman turns up and like Chinese say, hey, that's great, let's do it. It was much more sort of organic, right? It comes from below. It's something developed in relationship to China's particular history of economics, all sorts of stuff. So the story that they just have something waiting to go, I think, isn't quite there. There are people with sets of ideas around this. I mean, Peter Thiel would be somebody who has a fairly clear idea about what he thinks an ideal society would look like and wants to try and get there. But they don't have a complete plan to do that or a capacity to do that, and nobody else does either. That a great deal of this has to be a process of adaptation to the crisis itself. And in the course of that adaptation, you come up with some good ideas about what you might do somewhere down the line. I mean, it feels to me like, because I mentioned it, but it feels to me like the demand to reduce working hours has that quality. But actually, this is just a long-standing demand of the labour movement, which kind of ground to a halt, which it sort of turns out actually has a whole load of other advantages that we could make use of, and it's kind of popular. There's a very big trial of a 4-day week being run with a huge number of companies in Britain right now. There's a couple of universities, a couple of think tanks overseeing it, just to see how far you get with this. It feels to me like this is a win that we can get towards, because it's actually doing something people want, and it fits in with everything else, and it starts to open a vision of what a different society looks like. That it's one where you think less about how often, how much you're working, delivering these sets of material goods, more about not working so much, and having your material conditions secure, but here's a whole load of immaterial goods that you could take instead. That's quite a good thing that we've sort of stumbled on as a good part of what an adaptation, what a socially just and sustainable alternative might look like. So on the whole, I don't want to think that somebody else has a very clear plan that they're going to try and impose. I think there'll be several people with lots and lots of different ideas. But that's where the fight comes in. And it's not just like, it's not fighting lots of different ways. You know, if there's strikes, if there's protests, that's a version of it. It's also a fight over the ideas people have. There is, I think, a clear intellectual opening right now, because the failure in the mainstream is pretty severe. Because I think there's a failure on the kind of bits of the left around some of this stuff as well. That if we can start to win a version of how do you do economics that talks about, I would say at the core, decentering humanity, as human beings as the fundamental arbiter of this, and understanding the two-way relationship in nature, to put it in rather grandiose terms, then there's an intellectual fight that can be won there as well. And that, by the way, finally, gets us on to, can we think about utopia? Well, potentially, yes. Right? It may not be a utopia that is like space cars and we're all going to live on Mars because it's been terraformed by Elon Musk, third time. You know, by the way, if Mars is terraformed, it'll be us collectively that do it. I'll just say, I'm pro-terraforming Mars, by the way. I think that's going to be my controversial point to end on. But if we do it, it has to be a collective effort, and it has to be something decided on. It has to be all sorts of other things. And maybe we don't want to do it. We might discover there's life of some primitive kind on Mars, and we don't want to disturb it. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside. But there are utopias we can think of that don't depend on this kind of extreme version of material consumption for everyone, that do depend on slightly more, I'm sure everyone here is well aware of this, that do depend on slightly more, you know, expression of immaterial goods and immaterial value and things that aren't clearly, obviously just resource consumption, but we can all have better lives as a result of this. I mean, that's a kind of, you know, it's a utopia that starts to look achievable in the circumstances that we're in. I mean, as I said, I think fundamentally we need to think about life for us rather than sandcastles in the air and how wonderful it's all going to be. But you want to sail a life raft to somewhere, right? So you've got to have some idea of what the thing might look like on the other side.
Creo que podemos hacer una o dos preguntas más, luego hay una sorpresa y nos vamos. Bueno, si nadie, yo tengo otra pregunta más, si nadie se anima. A ver, me gusta esto que planteas de que un plan realista, digamos, de transformación económica en ausencia de crecimiento o con crecimiento muy pequeño es quitar, ¿no?, redistribución a un nivel muy agresivo de la gente que más tiene, de las instituciones, empresas que más tienen, al resto. Yo tengo dos preguntas sobre esto. La primera es que creo que esto vuelve un poco a la pregunta que planteaba, o sea, que siento ser pesado, pero creo que para eso hace falta una capacidad, ¿no?, de movilización social muy fuerte, que sea como un poder imparable, que aterrorice, ¿no?, o dé miedo a la gente y que haga eso como una alternativa deseable ante otra amenaza todavía mayor, ¿no? Entonces, mi pregunta creo que vuelve un poco a esa gente. ¿Qué motivaciones, ¿no? Lo que también te he preguntado antes, como qué tipo de motivaciones que incluso pueden llegar a ser, ¿no?, casi religiosas, como que no tienen que ser de cálculo racional, de, ¿no?, a esta serie de problemas, a estas soluciones, es un plan que me convence, voy a hacerlo. Creo que es como una visión un poco tecnocrática, ¿no?, y racionalista de la política. Yo creo que muchas veces son cosas más, ¿no?, de pasiones y de señalar enemigos que hay que derrotar, este tipo de cosas. Entonces, ¿qué tipo de motivaciones ves tú en un mundo como hacia el que vamos, que puedan, ¿no?, alimentar este tipo de grandes movilizaciones por una redistribución? Y la segunda pregunta, que es como un poco, creo yo, igual capciosa o, ¿no?, un poco en la revolución keynesiana, en la que hemos hablado antes, creo que parte de lo que motivó que realmente ocurriese fue el miedo a un enemigo exterior que era muy poderoso, ¿no? El movimiento comunista, los bolcheviques e incluso los movimientos socialistas y socialdemócratas organizados en esos países. Como que creo que parte del trato que se hizo ahí fue como, bueno, están estos muchachos aquí, si no queréis que pase algo muy terrible, pues habrá que reformar un poco cómo funciona el capitalismo, e igual hay que tener unos impuestos un poco más altos y tal, pero no es mejor que la alternativa, ¿no? Entonces, creo que eso, mi sensación es que eso sirvió para convencer a parte de la clase capitalista de que realmente eso era un buen plan. Mi pregunta es, ahora eso no existe, ¿no? Quiero decir, ahora el mundo es uno. Mi sensación es que, aunque haya guerras y tal, pero digamos que todos tienen como una matriz bastante similar, ¿no?, de pensamiento económico, político hasta cierto punto, ¿no? Como que las confrontaciones no permiten ese tipo, ¿no?, de enemigo exterior terrible que obliga como a reformas progresistas dentro de los países. Entonces, en ausencia de eso, en un mundo tan globalizado que realmente es mucho más homogéneo que otras veces, ¿crees que es posible, ¿no?, como ese convencimiento aparte de la clase capitalista de que deben reformarse, o va a tener que ser una cosa absolutamente, ¿no?, como interna, sin un enemigo exterior que pueda servir de aliciente? No sé si se ha entendido algo, pero bueno. Y si una pregunta más, si queréis, que sea un poco menos densa.
Vale, lo primero de todo, darte las gracias por la ponencia. Para mí ha sido una de las más buenas que hemos tenido hasta la fecha, así que gracias. Lo segundo que quería decir era, no tengo tan clara esa tesis que planteas de que ahora no hay un enemigo externo. De hecho, lo estamos viendo en cómo se está moviendo la OTAN ahora estos días, y lo vamos a ver en Madrid a finales de mes, cómo está planteando, ¿no?, esa alternativa de unos países democráticos, garantes de la democracia y demás, frente a, directamente señalan a China y a Rusia como los países autoritarios que quieren derribar la libertad, así en términos superayusistas. Lo que yo quería preguntar, además de decir esto, era, nosotros vamos a plantear un mundo con unos valores distintos, ¿no? La sobriedad, esto que decíamos de lo inmaterial. Entonces, ¿hacia dónde crees que la alternativa que quizás se pueda llamar ecofascista, como queramos llamarla, ¿qué crees que nos va a plantear? ¿Qué crees que le va a ofrecer a la clase trabajadora esa a la que tanto apela, por ejemplo, la extrema derecha aquí en España, o incluso se está viendo en el Reino Unido, ¿no? Como la extrema derecha está planteando el cambio climático como una oportunidad para, por fin, cerrar fronteras ante una amenaza externa de nuevo y poder implantar todas esas medidas que hasta ahora no han podido hacer porque la batalla cultural no han sido capaces de llegar hasta ahí.
Solo por matizar una cosa, yo creo que es verdad que hay enemigos externos, pero como que creo que la diferencia es que son enemigos externos que solo llevan en una dirección reaccionaria, ¿no?, a los cambios internos. Y en la otra situación yo creo que había como cierta posibilidad de que fuesen cambios progresistas. Ahora yo solo veo, como tú dices, ¿no?, como que va a ser como un cierre de las democracias occidentales, pero en un sentido, creo yo, negativo.
I mean, I think there's. God, I'll start with that point then and see where we get to. It's that there's an obvious sort of ideological reason for trying to say, well, here's like the West and its allies, and here's these bad authoritarians elsewhere. The really fundamental difference with the Cold War is not so much the character of those regimes is the way in which everybody starts to look like everybody else in a way that wasn't so apparent in the Cold War, right? There was a fairly stark contrast between the mode of economic governance in North America and Western Europe and the Soviet Union. Right, I don't think it was quite as big as sometimes it gets presented. I don't think it was like a fundamental civilizational divide and this was a radically new kind of society. That's a whole other mad and extended discussion we can get into. But nonetheless, it was different. Whereas what you have now is that quite strikingly, one of the pressures was saying, okay, we are probably moving out of this moving out of like neoliberalism as a guiding force here, is the fact you have something that in Washington gets referred to as a peer competitor that runs its economy somewhat differently, and that's China. And the response of the EU and states in North America and certainly Britain also is to increasingly do things that look a bit like what China is doing. Semiconductors, I think, is the most obvious version of this. Due to the shortage, although pressure was building up anyway, due to the shortage, everybody who needs semiconductors, which is everybody, has had a panic about where they're going to get them from. Because at the minute, a major source is sitting in Taiwan, and China has not at all disguised ambitions that Taiwan should be part of the rest of China. And then suddenly, a great chunk of your semiconductor supply chain has just disappeared, and this is a fundamental component you need for everything. So the EU and Britain and the US have all rushed off to write out huge state-led programs of how we're going to generate our own semiconductor industries to cope with that, which is exactly what China's been doing for the last 20 years, by the way, because they've been building up a state-led semiconductor program. Russia doing the same thing. The competitive pressures that operate in a world economy where that kind of neoliberal governance has broken down starts to turn into sort of state-led versions of growth and state capital fusions, and actually everyone starts to look kind of similar. So for all the ballyhoo about, oh well, we're very different to China, and there are clear differences in lots of different ways, the general tendency is that capitalism everywhere starts to look fairly similar. It's increasingly authoritarian everywhere, it's increasingly state-centered everywhere, and it's increasingly existing in basically a chaotic, disordered world, both politically and environmentally. So that's rather different to the kind of, in some ways, extreme stability balanced on the point of a nuclear weapon, but nonetheless stable world you had in the Cold War. So there's a sort of radical difference there. That also, I think, says to me that you do hear this, that it's the presence of an external thing that would be different that forces Western Europe to behave differently. And clearly there's some pressure from the East at various different points, right? It is obvious that the threat of the Soviet Union was identified in the West, not only externally, like can we have fight and win a war with Russia, but also internally we have these communist parties with this relationship. So that's there and true. more likely, given the stability of the whole system. I mean, bear in mind, when the Soviet Union collapsed, this took the CIA and everybody else basically by surprise. Now, it wasn't in their calculations because they accepted the stability and everyone knew that you had your patch here and they had their patch there. Occasional disputes between them, Vietnam being a case in point, but basically that was that. It's the internal pressures that produce social democracy in the West and various bits of reform in the US as well. And that's the internal pressure from a very large mobilised labour movement and its integration into capitalism in that Keynesian form, much more so than the external referent. If we're now in a world where that stability is gone, the Cold War version of stability is gone, the neoliberal pre-2008 version of stability is also gone, this sort of market-ordered version of stability is also gone, then on the one hand, that's very chaotic and lots of terrible things can happen and suddenly you find Russia invades Ukraine. But it's also, that's a much more open system for different possibilities. That's a system where you as an individual country, for example, have a broader range of options than you might have had under neoliberalism and that you might have had, would have had in fact in both cases, under the previous versions of stability. Because the world is unstable, so you could do your own thing and everybody else is crashing around doing their thing and nobody really has a handle on this, right? That's what the breakdown of hegemony means inside the world system. So that potentially, even though it's kind of chaotic and terrifying, is something that opens up different paths for individual countries to take. But that will depend then, I think, on the internal pressures, because I think that's what the process of reform inside a country looks like, much more so than big external factors. I mean, sometimes, you know, 2 countries or more countries go to war, that's a big external factor that can provoke an internal process of change very clearly. But short of that, and in the conditions we now exist in, where war is probably going to be more a part of life, but general instability is what we're looking at, then there's the process of winning those internal reforms and winning an internal vision and looking to internal forces. And I think for most developed countries, that does boil down to versions of, well, who are the working class and how do you mobilise that power that they potentially have? I mean, that's kind of the core of it. Now, I don't necessarily think that involves here are the trade unions we've always had and that's what it's going to look like. It could look far broader and bigger and different to historic mobilisations, and it almost certainly will do. But nonetheless, that's where you end up sort of locating that force for change. Just on the sort of the reactionary alternatives and things. This is not the best way to wrap everything up talking about eco-fascism, but here we are. I think you're absolutely right. There's quite a striking shift on the right. Not all of them, but like the way in which the reactionary right have gone from like climate change isn't happening to climate change is happening and it's real, and to quote Marine Le Pen's sort of second in command, that borders are the environment's best friend. That we have a world of chaos. We must build, therefore, a strong France or a strong Britain or strong whatever in order to deal with this. And part of that chaos is all these migrants who are being forced out by climate change. But we in France, we're going to protect the environment. Not like those people in China busy polluting the world with their new factories. It's sitting there, ready to be used. I thought Kate Aronoff, who's a sort of US environmental journalist, had a good survey of how this has changed and the rhetoric has changed in Europe over the last few years. But I think in a world of instability, like a version of what does an attempt to create an extreme version of stability look like is precisely around that. And it'll be an admission that the world is changing, that climate change is real, this is all bad and terrifying, here's a strong authoritarian state to deal with it all. Now, how we cope with an argument like this when we're all set up still to try and deal with climate change denial, which I think is increasingly just a marginal, like a really marginal event, I think is a challenge for us. But at least some of that has to be how do we win the argument around openness and cooperation and making that something that works in terms of the redistributive arguments that are probably the real key for the left to get into on this.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias.